Welcome to the DaVinci Hour podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Maxwell Cooper, and in this podcast series, I interview physicians, medical innovators, and entrepreneurs making an impact on healthcare. This podcast is produced by DaVinci Academy, a multimedia medical education company that provides podcasts, video courses, and digital textbooks. You can see more on our website, www.dviacademy.com, and our YouTube channel, youtube.com/c/DaVinci Academy Med. Hey everybody, welcome back to the DaVinci Hour podcast. I'm honored this week to be joined by Dr. Keith Matheny, an ENT surgeon and medtech entrepreneur in Dallas, Texas. So Dr. Matheny, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Of course, Maxwell. Thank you so much.
Awesome. So, maybe give us a little bit of an overview, where you went to school, where you did your residency training, and then maybe kind of a brief overview of what your clinical practice looks like right now.
Sure. So as you mentioned, I'm here in Dallas and specifically in North Dallas in the suburbs, and I'm back pretty much where I grew up. So I went to undergrad at Baylor down the road in Waco, then did my medical school in Houston at the amazing Texas Medical Center, which is 3 times as big. I was just back there for a medtech conference a few weeks ago. 3 times as big as it was back then. And even back then, it was the 10th largest city in Texas during the workday. So it's blossoming. And then I was fortunate to do my internship and my residency at Vanderbilt in Nashville. But we had 2 kids while I was a resident. And so we wanted them to be around their grandparents. And all 4 of them were in Dallas at the time. So we came back here. I joined a community practice. Vanderbilt trained us so well. I mean, again, so fortunate to go there, and felt comfortable really doing all aspects of ENT. So I joined a community practice here in the suburbs, just down the street from where I grew up, as I mentioned, and still am in a community practice, although I kind of refer to it as a secondary academic practice. We certainly have a lot of students of all types, medical students and nursing students and PA students that come through. So we have those teaching opportunities, and my partners and I are also very active in clinical trials and work closely with industry.
That's really cool. And though I know ENT, as we'll probably get into in a little bit, is a very broad field. I'm wondering, is there any particular area or patient population that you particularly focus on, or is it kind of just you dabble in everything?
Absolutely. Most of us do pare it down as we get older. So ENT is really 7 specialties, and they're only related by the anatomy. The technologies and the techniques can be quite disparate. So I specifically do rhinology, so sinus and allergy and some skull-based surgery, not as much as they would do in an academic center like Emory or Vanderbilt, but some of that. And over the last 20 years, as we'll detail throughout our discussion, much of the site of service for rhinology and other subspecialties in ENT has transitioned into the office setting. And that's been a hallmark of my career and something that I've enjoyed, that transition.
Now, as I mentioned, you're obviously also a medtech entrepreneur that has been involved in a variety of different businesses, which I'll definitely excited to talk with you about. But I'm curious right now, you're still practicing, and then you're balancing it with, these other endeavors. I guess what's your split? And I guess 1, how do you do that? And 2, how do you think each one enhances the other?
It's a challenge for those of us that try to do this. I mean, it really is having multiple full-time jobs. And as we all know in medicine, being a physician is way more than a full-time job, but we love it that way. That's why we chose it. So the short answer is you just overlay things one upon another. I think you do learn as a resident to be super efficient, whether it's sleeping a few minutes here and there or going to the bathroom, but certainly getting things done. You think, gosh, 5 minutes is a lot of time, and so I overlay things. Now, more specifically, I probably am practicing about 70% of what I used to full-time, but I do it more strategically. So I have 2 full clinical days a week. ENT obviously has a lot of clinic to it. I have a full operative day on Friday and a half operative day on Mondays. So I have pretty much blocked out Monday afternoons and all day Tuesdays for my other business responsibilities. And so that doesn't mean that I can fit everything in that day and a half, of course. So I do a lot of things between patients or during lunches or before and after clinic. But I think I found a nice balance. There certainly are times, and in other podcasts and interviews I've talked about, there are days when you feel like I'm not doing any of these roles even adequately, but then there are other days you think, wow, that's really fun that just today I operated and I did this and we accomplished that as a team, and so it's very rewarding. And there are more of those days than the discouraging days, for sure.
That's awesome. Yeah, that variety is pretty cool. I mean, you have obviously kept your hand in, seeing patients. I'm curious if some med tech entrepreneurs that are also physicians I've talked to, some of them, have left clinical practice, and obviously people do that for a variety of reasons. Did that ever cross your mind to do that, or not really? And I'm curious, maybe why not?
Yeah. From a time standpoint, it does cross my mind, thinking, boy, what I could do if I really just focused on this endeavor or that one. But my feeling on that topic, and I think the majority of those like you and I, Maxwell, are what really empowers and uplifts our entrepreneurial pursuits is the fact that we are physicians, not just being a physician in name. What I mean is actually touching patients and recognizing on a daily basis, okay, well, I could improve things this way, or what tool I really need if I had something like this. And I think that's what distinguishes us as physician entrepreneurs from engineers. And I think that's why strategics, these companies spend a lot of time and spend some money having us as consultants, because they don't have access to the patients. As soon as we hang up our scrubs, so to speak, and just become engineers and business people, I think we really set ourselves up to lose touch with what makes our products unique. So I am a huge proponent of at least continuing to practice as much as you can. Some specialties lend themselves to that more than others. It's hard to be a surgeon and be part-time, right? Because you have to evaluate a whole bunch of new patients, and those that you feel are candidates for surgery, kind of nurse them through that process, actually do the intervention, and then nurse them through the post-op period, as opposed to someone maybe that works in emergency medicine or anesthesia or something else, traditional radiology, not interventional radiology, but traditional radiology, where you can kind of cordon off different parts of your day and different parts of your week. So it is a constant challenge, but I think it's the lifeblood of a physician entrepreneur and what distinguishes us, the fact that we still are touching patients.
Yeah, definitely. I think I would echo that in my limited experiences that, even since when I graduated med school, I see things, as I've gained experience as a resident, you see things differently. And I agree with you, seeing patients, doing the procedures, learning those types of things, it helps you think of ideas that if you had, you weren't still in the game, so to speak, you wouldn't necessarily
Absolutely.
think of that.
The flip side is also true, right? And not to be critical, but there are so many times that I see products that are in somebody's upstream development, and there's just not the common sense that we get because we're actually seeing patients. You may see some contraption and prototype and immediately think, how is the physician going to actually ever use that in a patient? Why would they use it in a patient? Or really much more prescient is, why would an insurance company ever reimburse a physician for using that in a patient, right? That's really the first question when you're at the whiteboard or even the cocktail napkin stage of an idea is, will this be reimbursed? Because if it won't be, you're wasting a lot of time and a lot of investors' money, no matter how great the idea is. And so I think that's the other part of being a physician entrepreneur is you have some of that natural common sense of what would actually work in clinical practice. And someone that is not touching patients may not have that.
Yeah, definitely. I'm curious, how did you get started doing this? Did you do like some of those consulting roles, or did you just have like an idea and just went right into it? Or I guess
very serendipitous and very gradual. So I have a few more gray hairs than you. So it's been a long road, but gosh, I love it. And I'm so thankful and grateful for where I am. So if I might take a little time and just tell the story, I think it answers
Sure.
a lot of those questions, and it allows me to thank a lot of people along the way because so many people have helped. So when I joined this practice in the suburbs of Dallas 20 years ago, I think exactly 20, a few months past 20 years ago, I joined two great physicians. I mean, absolutely fantastic physicians, and who were doing an excellent job at patient care. But like most physicians, they were not running a very good business. And so I refer to those days as us being very busy in spite of the surroundings. And this is far and away the rule, not the exception, no matter what specialty it is, no matter what time period we're talking about. We all go to school until our early to mid 30s, and we never even have, most of us never even have 3 credit hours of business 101. And then all of a sudden we're unleashed on these multi-million-dollar businesses. And what do? Well, we bequeath those responsibilities of running these businesses to the person that seems like they know what they're doing. And that's usually a nurse or maybe not even a formal RN or a medical assistant, but someone that's been around the block for 20 years, and maybe they know how to interface with insurance companies and kind of sort of know how to do billing and collecting and this, that, and the other. Maybe they don't, but it's someone that knows more than we do as physicians, right? And so our practice was exactly like that. My first week of practice, I had 50 new patients. I mean, during COVID, I would have killed for a week of 50 new patients, right? Or, I mean, even still, as we climb out of that. So, and that was just from the overflow of my two partners. So just answering the phone. So they were doing something right. And namely, they were taking care of their referring physicians and doing a great job with their patients. But the setting was this. We were in an old office. So 20 years ago, we were in an office that was already 30 years old at that time. So 50 years old now. By a dying HCA hospital. The hospital has since reinvented itself and is thriving. But back then it was in bad shape. The staff in our clinic was a conglomeration of 3 different practices that had merged, and one physician retired. And so those 3 groups of individuals didn't get along with each other. And there were cliques and that showed forth in poor customer service. We had paper charts. We had at least a rudimentary computerized scheduling system, but more or less paper revenue cycle, paper billing and collecting. ENT, not only is there 7 subspecialties, but there are a lot of ancillary revenue opportunities. If you think about hearing aids and allergy shots and doing cosmetic injections, Botox and collagen, lots of sleep studies. I mean, there's so many ancillary opportunities. And either this practice at the time was not involved in those, or the ones that they had were actually losing money. And, if you take a hearing aid business, for example, that's difficult to lose money. They're typically marked up several $100%. But nevertheless, this practice figured out how to lose money at the time doing that. And so, again, just because no special training, I was a biology major undergrad and did all the same medical school classes that you did, the same ones I did in college with the same textbooks. It's crazy. I just took over business operations because the other 2 guys really weren't interested in it, weren't passionate about it. They were making the revenue they needed to make for their families, and they weren't really worried about it. And so I'm pleased to say 4 or 5 years later, we had really transformed our practice. So we had moved away from that office into 3 different brand new modern offices in 3 different parts of this catch area, taking advantage of different referral networks, building new bridges, so rapidly increasing patient care. The number of patients we were seeing, we had figured out how to implement and optimize mid-level providers, which is a mainstay now. But 15 years ago, it wasn't as common, and we didn't really know what to do with them. We'd gone paperless. We had really tightened up our revenue cycle, our billing and collecting. We had a optimized web presence, whatever that looked like in 2006, 2007. Obviously, SEO and those things are much, much different now. In all of our ancillaries, we got involved in everything, and we made them all profitable. So hearing aid and allergy and cosmetics and sleep and voice and those things were now profit centers for us too. And so people around Dallas-Fort Worth took notice and asked, hey, would you help us bring on a PA? Would you help us fix our hearing aid department? Would you help us start an allergy department? And so I formed a consulting company called Solutions for Otolaryngology. And that's the underpinnings of a much bigger company now we'll talk about in a moment called ENT. But I was really happy with that. The things that I had learned by making some good guesses, but mostly making some mistakes and learning from mistakes or mistakes of others and then righting the ship, I was able to then take that to other practices. And so that still exists today, that consulting arm of ENT. And so over the years, I've managed parts or all of many, many different ENT practices, facial plastics practices, things like that. And it's very rewarding. So a few years after that, the idea of taking this more national came about, and I began to explore what that looked like. And this is one of many, many serendipitous things that happened in my career. My uncle, who is an oncologist in Virginia Beach, Norfolk, he's now retired, but he was one of the founding physicians of U.S. Oncology. U.S. Oncology around here, people would know Texas Oncology in different parts of the country. You may still know it by your local oncology brand name, which is important even from a business standpoint, that decision. But they're all under a McKesson company called U.S. Oncology. What U.S. Oncology is a national network of oncologists that have united since 1993, so almost 30 years ago, to take advantage of scale in their purchasing. So chemotherapy and all the paraphernalia you need to infuse chemo, to do insurance contracting on a much more cohesive basis. We hear a lot now about residents at various institutions unionizing. Well, this is a form of that took place in 1993. Physicians banding together to monitor their outcomes and take their superior outcomes to payers and command better reimbursement rates. And all the different things that you can accomplish with scale, such as large clinical trials. Much of the way that we currently treat breast and colon and other major cancers came out of U.S. Oncology, as opposed to the large academic institutions. And so my uncle and I just happened to be on vacation together right after McKesson acquired U.S. Oncology. This would have been 2011, 2012, for a huge number. I think back then it was 2.1 billion. And McKesson was really happy with that acquisition. So the power of McKesson aligned with the power of U.S. Oncology really was synergistic. And so McKesson really wanted to replicate that in other medical specialties. Well, my uncle was talking about that with me, and I was telling him about my consulting company and all that I learned in my practice. And he said, you should talk to the McKesson guys about ENT. That seems like a perfect specialty for them to prove these same concepts in. And so I did, and spent a couple of years and went all the way up in McKesson, and they were very enthusiastic and excited about ENT. But McKesson, being far and away the world's largest healthcare company, twice as big as Johnson & Johnson, in fact, twice, they had no idea how to do anything early stage. And so they said, we love ENT, we believe in this, so come see us in about 10 years when you build this, and we'll talk. And so they punted me to the same private equity firm, Welsh, Carson, Anderson, and Stowe, that put together U.S. Oncology at this point, 20 years before. And that's when we went about really evaluating the market and what a national ENT platform could look like. The first playbook we used was the one that U.S. Oncology used, namely mergers of practices, truly buying practices lock, stock, and barrel and merging them together with private equity money. The ENT space, long story short, even still today, is not very enthusiastic about that. There's finally some practices that have partnered with private equity in ENT, but certainly 10 years ago, the specialty was very skeptical and nervous about that. So that didn't seem to be the clear path forward. But what was going on simultaneously, and what led to one of my other lives in the med device space, was this transition of the site of service for most of our procedures that I mentioned at the outset of this discussion. So what was going on was most specifically balloon sinuplasty, the transition of an angioplasty catheter, one that you use in interventional radiology all the time, Maxwell, that was adapted by a brilliant physician, Josh Mackauer, who's founded many companies out of his incubator in Palo Alto area. But he brought the balloon into the ENT space. And that was such a revolutionary procedure, almost a little bit ahead of its time. There was quite a bit of politics and controversy about that compared to traditional sinus surgery. That's its own podcast, the discussion of that. But by 2011, we finally were so comfortable doing the balloon procedure in the OR that we thought we could do it in the office, and we received CPT codes from the AMA and Medicare reimbursement, and we were starting to do that in the office. And while that's a fantastic thing for everything, it's cheaper for the system, it's healthier and safer for the patient. With the preferential reimbursement, the physician actually can generate a little more revenue. So it's a win-win-win. The problem was, all of a sudden, the cost of practicing ENT skyrocketed. So the hospital the year before was buying these balloons at several $1,000s a pop. And now to do the office balloon, I was getting a bill from Johnson & Johnson, or I was getting a bill from Stryker. And so it made ENT a very expensive specialty to practice. So circling back to the discussion about the consulting company, we realized that the path forward for a national ENT platform really looked like some organization that could help with these skyrocketing costs, could help negotiate pricing, work on inventory management, those types of things, and one that could bolster reimbursement or at least keep it neutral, so we could afford to do these things in the office. And so we decided to make the consulting company a GPO. And what that acronym stands for is a group purchasing organization. And it's a true legal structure. It's not just a loose buying group like Costco or something. It's a formal structure. We have a lot of safe harbors to meet. We have a lot of hurdles to clear. We have a lot of reporting to do on a constant basis. But what it is a collection of individuals, in our case, physicians, who purchase products for their practice in bulk as a group. And so we can command much better pricing. And so we now have that today, but it took years and years to negotiate the contracts and to assemble a membership with enough scale to actually garner some good pricing, which we have now. So where that company sits, so the consulting company grew into what we now call is USENT Partners. We have 630 something physicians on our way to about 1,000 by the end of this calendar year, purchasing through about 40 direct contracts. So those are with the balloon companies and the capital companies and the hearing aid companies and the allergy companies and the sleep companies, all the different vendors that we use to practice our craft. And across a clinic, we bring an average of 20% savings. The average ENT physician now spends about $400,000 a year just on supplies. That's not as a practice, that's as an individual. So we're putting, roughly $85,000 to $100,000 back into the physician's practice, almost always without them having to switch the technology that they think is best for their patients. So that company is very rewarding to bring that kind of cost savings to my colleagues, but it also allows me to do what I love, the consulting of the business. So as my team is probably sick of hearing me say this, but day one is cost savings. That's great. But day 2 through infinity, we're going to help them run better businesses. So, identifying new revenue opportunities, streamlining what they're currently doing, tightening up the business operations and those things. So when you talk about how I divided my time, that side gig probably takes up the majority of my time. It's the one for which I travel the most and certainly have the most ongoing correspondence and meetings. So that's USENT.
So sorry to interrupt. Is that,
Go
I just
ahead.
want to
Yeah.
ask real quick.
Yeah.
So with that company, essentially what's from your guys and what's the business model? Is it these practices remain separate, but they essentially
Yes.
join you guys as members of your business, and then
Yes.
as a perk of being a member, they get obviously better pricing and better representation when it comes to purchasing supplies and things like that.
You hit the nail on the head. So it is quite distinct from a private equity driven or any kind of external force where the practices are merged together. So our practices are all independent entities, their own tax ID numbers, and they're all over the 50 states. It's a US based company at this point. Probably always will be for what we do, just with the US healthcare system. But they're independent practices. And so they have the freedom to interface with our supplier contracts on what they use and opt out of things that they don't use, or if they want an alternative technology. And they just are able to receive the discounts. The way a GPO is structured, the entity receives a rebate or an admin fee from the supplier on the transaction. And that's a small percentage of the potential savings to the practice. And so that's how we run our operations and pay our staff and pay the electric bill and things like that to run that company. But the vast majority, 97% of the savings goes to the physicians. In our case, it's actually free to join. We're just happy to share these contracts, and the bigger we all get, the better the contracts will be next time we negotiate. So yeah, you hit the nail on the head.
That's great. No, that's I'm curious, are there a lot of, I know you mentioned oncology, are there a lot of other specialties that of doing this? Because there's like orthopedics or like cardiology or anything like have you heard of that, or is this kind of
There are several. There are
Okay.
several, but far from all specialties. So this concept really lends itself mostly to those that do a lot in their office, or in an in-office OR, or maybe even an ASC, an ambulatory surgery center. So it doesn't really apply to all specialties, but many specialties it does. And there are many of these similar type companies out there. We are the only one currently in the ENT space. There are several really high caliber hearing aid buying groups. They aren't formal GPOs, but that do a great job. I know there's an allergy one. And then some of the larger private equity roll-up entities, they are able to take advantage of their scale to negotiate good pricing for all of their members. But in other specialties, there are several.
Interesting. Something you touched on was, the development of the balloon catheter device for sinus disease. I'm curious, how did you get started? You alluded to this a little bit, but how did you get started doing that? Like, what were kind of, the early steps and early partners you made that you thought were kind of critical to getting that idea off the ground?
Yeah. So when I was sitting where you were as a PGY3 at Vanderbilt, do anything for a free steak, right? In a night out. Yeah. Back then you're not making a lot of money now, I don't think, but we were making way less than minimum wage back in the day. And so I always was enthusiastic when the device companies would come and want us to try their upstream products and introduce new technology to us. But really, I didn't think much more about it after trying things. But I always noticed my passion and how much I enjoyed those. So that continued out in my community practice. And I think I developed some sort of reputation for being an early adopter, or at least someone that was always willing to try new technology and put in my 2 cents. And so by the time the balloon was being commercialized, it was probably 5 years into my practice. And so I was one of those individuals that they sought to try this newer technique. And that really continued. So that would have been, 5, 6, 7 years into my practice. And in a real critical time, I mean, there were so many people and so much technology that taught me things, but I think a real pivotal moment was in the fall of 2011 when a company named Intersect ENT, wonderful company that Medtronic just picked up earlier this year, Medtronic ENT acquired them. Intersect makes drug-eluting bioabsorbable stents. So again, you're seeing a trend here. A lot of cardiology technology, cardiovascular technology has come into the ENT space over the last 20 years. And so by that time, I was fortunate to be able to do the first couple commercial cases of their stents. They brand them as the Propel stents. Really nice technology. I do a lot of research and speaking about it still, even 10, 11 years later. Immediately when I did those first couple cases, I thought, well, there's a million other reasons or uses for something like this. And I'm sure many, many other physicians thought the same thing. But as has been the rule in my career, people at Intersect were very ethical and honest with me and basically told me to shut up, not be spouting off these ideas, that I should actually protect them, which I didn't even know what they meant by that. And it's hard to believe just 11 years ago, now I have dozens and dozens of patents, and when I had things protected, to come back and talk to them. And so not really knowing where to turn, but pushing forward and meeting with an IP attorney, an intellectual property attorney, and filing some provisional patents, and learning about that really kicked off this part of my career, the med device and technology development. And so I did just that. And within about 6 months, once I had some patent protection, I went back to that original company and said, okay, here's my idea. This is so great. Let's put together some prototypes and we can be using this in patients in a couple months, right? And I sit here 11 years later, having just commercialized about 5 or 6 months ago the technology that I thought of in 2011. So I was so naive, not just about how to patent things, but actually what it takes to have an idea and to jot it down on a whiteboard or whatever, but actually to get it in patients, to get it through regulatory, through all the clinical trials, through the reimbursement hurdles and all those things to actually use it. And it's formidable. But so what the first mistake I made, again, out of total naivete, was taking the idea to all of the big ENT companies and saying, isn't this great? Doesn't this make so much sense? And of course, they were all very nice and respectful, knowing that I was a customer, right? In retrospect, but knowing that these large companies have no capacity. That's not what they do. They don't develop new ideas. They build markets. They grow technology that's already been proven, and they bring it to a lot more patients. Well, I didn't really stop and think about that. I thought, well, these are the 6 major ENT companies. One of them is going to like this and develop it for me. And so I spent a lot of time, 2 or 3 years, again, simultaneous with when we were building the group purchasing organization. So a lot of them were the people that I was negotiating contracts with in the GPO were also the people that I was pitching my med device ideas to. And so that was nice to really build those deep relationships with those individuals in those C-suites, but it really was the wrong play, as you know, in med device. And I finally learned by 2015, 2016. And so at that time, I was fortunate to encounter several people that actually helped us get to where we are now, 5 or 6 years later. So people that were skilled in device development early stage, people that knew how to raise money to finance that, people that knew how to expand our IP protection and just to run a business, how to go through regulatory, how to commercialize a product. And so that's when the trajectory really went vertical, is once I surrounded myself with the right people in the device world. And of course, my specific idea was very difficult. It was to make a dissolvable splint that we would use after septoplasty or rhinoplasty, so after nose jobs, but one that was very sturdy during the healing process. That would be hemostatic and antimicrobial because of the materials we chose. But then when we were done with it, would basically just dissolve into a puff of smoke. And so all those things were diametrically opposed, and engineers scoffed and laughed, and I now know what a difficult ask that was, especially the material chitosan that I wanted to build this device out of. And so there were lots of stops and starts and iterations and things, but we finally have just that, where we have the capability to 3D print in this material chitosan, a wonderful material that you use in wound dressings, probably in your field, Maxwell. And we use all throughout the nose for epistaxis and post-sinus surgery, but have it sturdy enough to stabilize the airway while it's healing, but then to dissolve or easily be removed and provide those benefits all along the way. And so I'm really happy with it. I don't know if I told my 2011 self that it would be 2022 second quarter when we were commercializing. If I would have pushed through, I probably would have, but I would have been shocked that it would take that long. It's all about surrounding yourself with the right people, right? And so I now have the opportunity to save people a lot of time. And I love when other entrepreneurs, especially physician entrepreneurs, come to me to hear the story, because I feel like I can save them years of time that I wasted learning these lessons the hard way. And as I said at the outset, I think physician entrepreneurs are really unique and will always play a major role in new technology, because we're the ones that know what we need. We're the ones that know what's not real easy to use in our clinical practice and how things can be better.
That's really fascinating, and congratulations on your recent success. That's amazing. That's, especially sticking with it 11 years. That's a long time to dedicate to something. And really, I think it's so cool how you integrated, concepts from other fields like cardiology, like you were saying, and applied them to your own. I'm curious, one thing I'm wondering, and I've actually wondered this for a long time, and I'm curious from your perspective, is it easier to do device or technology development in academia more so, or private practice? And I guess I'm curious from your perspective,
Great question.
like why, or maybe even the pros and cons of doing it in either one, in either venue.
Great question. Haven't really been asked that directly, but so there are challenges to both and there are advantages to both. So first, from a physician standpoint, when we're in an academic setting, almost always the academic institution owns all the intellectual property. And so whatever you dream up and invent can be very difficult to tease out as your own idea, or certainly your own property. The things that I researched at Vanderbilt as a resident, we had some, amazing cancer drugs. That's what I did most of my research there at the Vanderbilt Cancer Center. And those drugs are now commercially used, but Vanderbilt owns them, not the head of my lab or the other physicians that worked with me on the research. So that's an advantage of being out in the community, is whatever I dream up, I own that intellectual property. The downside is that I don't have the infrastructure that an academic center has to conduct the clinical trials. There are fantastic, and I've found ways in multiple companies to outsource things, outsource even my C-suite operations. And there are great clinical research organizations that can help, but it sure is nice for the academic inventor to have the institutional expertise on that. They may even have their own IRB in-house. And so everything from soup to nuts can be done there in that institution. I'm biased because I am out in the community, but I'm thankful that I own my intellectual property, and I found ways to conduct meaningful clinical research in the community setting. And so I prefer that freedom, but there are certainly advantages to being in an academic setting too.
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm curious, that's obviously huge, the intellectual property component. And then I think you make a great point about how, there's, patent advisors and attorneys even on staff at some academic places, which you may or may not have in private practice or community setting. I'm curious for the community physicians out there that, want to, have great ideas and, want to see them, try bringing them to fruition. What's your advice where maybe not as obvious, like, I guess, one where they could, protect their idea, maybe, patent it if it seems like something that's a good idea, and kind of take those first steps, because it may not be as, I guess, obvious in that arena.
I think it's right at your fingertips. The first step is to, what I do is Google patents and just see. I can't even remember how many millions of patents have been issued, and there's probably millions more that are pending on all kinds of ideas. And so first you want to see if your idea is even protectable. Now, the asterisk there is a good patent attorney can almost always find an angle or a view of your idea that hasn't quite been protected. So first, in your own search, the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, the USPTO, also has a great website that's very easy to search. So you can just see what's out there, see what your competition is for your idea. And then in most major law firms, there are extensive intellectual property attorneys that pretty reasonably can help you file provisional patents. You can do it on your own. Some of these legal websites where you can do all sorts of contracts and documents, I mean, that's better than nothing. That's better than you just going unprotected and talking about it to other physicians or certainly to industry. While my experience has 98% been very upstanding and ethical, I've had people try to completely abscond with my ideas and make me a paid consultant and walk away with the value of these things. And so, again, that's the exception, not the rule, but you have to be smart about it. And so even having a cobbled together patent application, I mean, all what that gives you is the priority date. It's official. There's no style points with the USPTO, right? It's did you file and pay the fee or not? And if you did, then you own that date for a long period of time for you to actually fine tune it and write a better application. But at that point, then I think, physicians need to know, just like we talked about in business, physicians are brilliant people as a rule. You wouldn't have got into medical school and matched in a great residency if you weren't, but that doesn't mean we know everything about business for sure, but also about the law. And so that's where you get what you pay for in a patent attorney. And when you get down to splitting hairs over whether your idea is obvious, I can't tell you how many times I've heard that term, based on some patent from 50 years ago, or not really, those have expired, but from prior art, and say, well, anybody would have thought that that's a natural extension of this, so we're not going to issue a patent. You really need a clever patent attorney to figure out some unique angle so you have something that's protected. Because when you get down the road and you're looking to sell this company, the person buying or investing in the company is going to want to know that their money is protected by an idea that's protected, and that it's not very easy to copy it. So first things, just to summarize, search on your own, see what's out there, and then file something, get some kind of provisional patent filed, but then do the work and pay the legal fees for a very skilled intellectual property attorney to take the next steps.
I think that's a great point. You get what you pay for, and, thankfully most physicians make a nice income where they can, certainly, if they're really passionate. And I think that goes back to your point earlier where, make sure this is a good idea, make sure you at least vet it as much as you can, that, like you said, can you even get paid for it? Is it realistic? Because it does, even though physicians make nice money, we're not, making billions of dollars here. So
Right.
you have
can
to
add up quickly.
Yeah. I'm curious. So let's say you've made that step, you've patented your idea. The next step is obviously, getting some type of prototype, getting the design refined, all those things, which also cost money. And so let's say it gets to a point where you're like, maybe it's kind of outside your wheelhouse as far as how much you can afford. What's your, advice as far as, getting funding? Do you try to can you get grants like you can in academia if you're in private practice, or do you try to go to investors? Maybe curious what you did as well in your process.
Well, again, I can look back and act like I did all these things intentionally, but in many cases, I was just very fortunate. But the landscape is different. So this is, if you and I were, whatever a podcast was 20 years ago, it probably would have been actually a face-to-face conversation. Imagine that. And we were talking about this topic. Back then, it was pretty easy to raise a lot of money. I mean, it was expected for most things to kind of flop or for you to be pretty loosey-goosey with the money and spend a lot by the time you got to the market. That's not the case now. And so it is very hard, especially early stage, to find any money from an anonymous investor or someone that you don't have a personal relationship with. So you will get to a point in these ideas where you'll be tested. How serious are you about bringing this to the market? And how much are you willing to take out of your own personal income and away from your family to chase your dream? And so at that point, I think the first source of funding would be, the colloquial term friends and family. So other physicians, people that want to put in $10,000, $50,000, which is a lot of money, but we're not talking about $50 million from an investment firm on Sand Hill Road in Palo Alto, right? And so a lot of times nowadays, that's all you're going to get. You may have a couple $100,000, maybe $500,000, and you have to really push the idea quite a ways before you can expect more cash infusion. The trade-off, too, is every time you take an investor, you're diluting yourself, not diluting, but diluting. And so I've seen it so many times that by the time a great idea finally gets to market, it's been, in my case, 11 years. Thankfully, I have guarded my equity closely, because in 11 years, I could look up and own a fraction of 1% because of all the money that I could have taken during that time. And then nobody makes much money once there finally is an exit. So a physician entrepreneur needs to be very frugal, and that's the landscape now. Big companies are built for a few $1 million now, not hundreds of millions like it was 20 years ago. And that's done in a lot of ways. One, being very frugal, but also fractional teammates. So my commercial lead in the device company serves that function for 2 or 3 other companies too, because I don't need him 24/7 where we are now. I probably will, and then I will pay him appropriately. But the people that invested at the beginning, we have not taken any compensation in the device company. So we're really working for the future value. So that saves money, as opposed to hiring a whole bunch of executives that expect a certain level of compensation and a certain level of equity. And then outsourcing. So outsourcing the regulatory consultant, outsourcing the development. Even when you get to the point of commercialization, the choice between hiring a very expensive sales force on your own versus using distributors who buy your product at a wholesale price, and then it's on them to sell. There's so many decisions all along the way, but that's how a physician can run a very lean operation and not raise millions and millions and millions of dollars, but still get to the goal line.
That's I think great advice, really interesting. I'm curious, this is an arduous process, like you said, and it's a long process. It's very expensive, obviously. I've heard some entrepreneurs say you need to also recognize when you should, kind of not throw in the towel, but realize that, maybe you should move on to something else. I guess do you have any thoughts on that? Like if there's, certain tells or certain signs where maybe this is something where, versus when, to save yourself essentially, 10 years and $1 million later.
Yeah, exactly. That's a tough decision, right? Because I think our profession chooses people that think opposite, right? We're used to being, and where you are as a resident, as a PGY3, I mean, you're given a ton of autonomy and a ton of responsibility. So we're trained to function that way. And that's not the best way to function in real life probably, but certainly in technology development, you actually really need to rely on a team. And so, the physician entrepreneur a lot of times has to, or has a hard time recognizing when they've exhausted their expertise and they need to let their colleagues take over operations. That's one. That's not directly what you asked. Your question is really, all right, when have you worked on it enough and it's just not going to work and you're throwing good money after bad? That's tough. There were times that I thought, well, is this really going to be ever, commercially viable? And I'm glad I persisted with all of these companies, but it did take a much longer time than I thought it would. I think what I hang my hat on is if you can still see a clear path on how a physician can use your idea in patients, including reimbursement, all of those types of things, I think you should still go forward. If that path is murky, you're probably wasting your time and money.
Interesting. I'm curious also, a lot of people are focusing on how we can save the healthcare system money as well.
Yeah.
Sure, you may be able to get reimbursed, but does it cost the hospital more than, the standard of care or what they would have thought, which I imagine would be a deterrent to, using a certain product. I'm curious, how much did that play into your like device development and your other digital health endeavors?
Very important question. Yeah. Hospital systems are, unlike physician practices, hospital systems are run by good business people. And they're not biased or blinded by clinical bells and whistles, if they really, the hospital administrators care about patient outcomes, of course. They care about the patients, but they look at it from, well, what technology is good enough for these patients to have good outcomes, but not exorbitantly priced. And so there's always this balance. And so when you have any new technology now, it is incumbent on the company developing it to show the value proposition to the physician in the hospitals. So excellent point. My device, the first device company that we just launched, is a tad more expensive than what we're competing with. But what we're competing with has been around for 50 years, and it's very uncomfortable. It has a lot of potential complications and downsides for patients. So we've spent the time and money showing the distinction to the committee. And hospitals don't only care about the bottom line. They're also beholden to their surveys and their scores and their rating systems. And so when you have a technology that patients are happier with, they have good outcomes, they're more comfortable, that's important for them too. But the onus is on the developing company to demonstrate the value to the hospital system. And you're right, there's always this cost benefit analysis. It's a fine line to walk, because when you have a long-term company and you still have products in the pipeline, you need to have a margin on what you're selling today so you can invest that margin into future products or to pay your investors back or whatever. So everybody understands that. It's just, so it's always pushing the price point of what you're selling in the context of what a hospital system or a physician is going to think is a good value for that patient. You can't get greedy. I've seen that. And people lie to themselves and say, well, if I don't set the price point here, I can never take it back. And someday when we have a CPT code, then it'll be reimbursed at this rate. And if we start lower, I get all those arguments, but I think people are deceiving themselves in being greedy. And then it can end up being so expensive that patients never get the technology to begin with.
Definitely. Real quick, I want to ask you about your, not only have you done device development, but you've done digital health with your sleep monitoring company. I'm curious, maybe tell us a little bit about that. And then what are kind of some major differences between developing like a digital health technology versus like an actual device? And I think some of the device developers out there might be, oh man, they have it so easy. It's just software, and that, but I imagine there's some unique challenges with that as well.
Yeah. I think it is a little bit easier, but I'm blessed to have really great software developers. So, what you're referring to, Maxwell, is Sleep Vigil, and it's a technology that takes data from a consumer wearable like my Apple Watch or a Garmin or an Oura Ring into a format in our electronic medical records where physicians can review that data for, first of all, patient tweaking and better patient care, but also billing under some new RPM codes, remote patient monitoring codes that came out just before COVID in 2019. So it's new revenue for a practice too. So what Sleep Vigil does is look at the patient's oxygen level, their SpO2, while they're sleeping. So we're monitoring our sleep apnea patients on a nightly basis. And the reason that was important to me and my partners in Sleep Vigil is because we do a lousy job as physicians caring for sleep apnea patients. And it's a very severe disease. People think of sleep apnea perhaps as snoring, and it's more of a social problem where bed partners sleep in different rooms and are angry at each other. It's way more than that. It's sleeping a significant part of the night with suboptimal oxygen level and maximally stressing your cardiovascular and your neurological system months and years to the point where it can be fatal. So it's a much bigger deal than just snoring. And how the current landscape is, first of all, we're only probably treating 10% of people in the United States and less worldwide that have this severe disease. So 90% are not even being treated. And the 10% that are, what we do is we go through the workup, we diagnose sleep apnea, we prescribe a certain treatment, whether it's CPAP or a dental sleep appliance, and then we send them on their way. Maybe we see them once a year, and we do a follow-up sleep study about every 3 years, as mandated by, or as the insurance companies let us do. Well, we have no earthly idea what's going on a night-by-night basis in that 1, 2, or 3 years. Are they optimally managed? Are they not? Are there variations in their disease state? And the answer, of course, is yes. There are variations, and no, they are not optimally managed. And so what this technology does is very similar to what RPM is used for in a patient with hypertension or a patient with diabetes, is a way for a clinician to check on them very frequently and to make clinical adjustments for much better patient outcomes, which, as you said earlier, saves the system a lot of money, while the physician is also remunerated just a little bit. So those RPM codes, they're not huge reimbursements, but at least it's something. And in the way that they're assigned, if a physician looks at patient data, and it has to come in electronically, it can't be a sticky note where the patient took their own blood pressure and drops it off at the front door. It has to come in an unadulterated fashion, HIPAA compliantly, into the physician's chart. But if that physician looks at that data for as little as 20 minutes a month, then they can bill a certain amount of money to the payers. And so it's what we all want to do as we're developing technology, right? It's something that dramatically improves patient care and patient outcomes, but it also is a profitable venture. And this is just that. And so I'm blessed to have, again, like in all of my companies and even in my practice, just amazing partners, brilliant technology people that are able to, it sounds simple the way I explained it, but it is not simple, to interface with all these devices and to take their oxygen data and put it into a cohesive dashboard that a clinician can actually review. But that's what that company does. And so I failed to mention at the beginning is, yes, I do a lot of sinus and allergy. I pick boogers, right? But as I've gone on over the years, I've seen how much the nose impacts sleep. And so now I take care of a lot of sleep patients too. And so this is the natural outcropping of that. I'm really excited about this company. It's newer. We just founded it a couple of years ago, so we're just now commercializing it too. But I think it has enormous potential, positive potential, to improve our care of the sleep disordered breathing patients.
That's really cool technology. I mean, I think especially monitoring patients. And yeah, I just even remember learning in med school, like how much, like you mentioned, the, sleep apnea can really stress the cardiovascular system. And, it's one of those, I feel like you may not see the immediate benefits of it immediately, but I think it's something, long term, like you said, if
Yeah,
you can
we
prevent,
know, right?
yeah.
We know their hypertension is going to be better controlled. There's going to be less cardiac events, less cerebrovascular events. I mean, we know even motor vehicle accidents and other things that are caused. Last week was, I think, drowsy driving week on social media. Maybe I saw a whole bunch of posts on various social media outlets, and that is like driving drunk, driving drowsy. And so if the 10%, which is abysmal, if the 10% of people that we actually are treating, we're not even doing a good job. And then there's also these 90% out there driving drowsy too. I mean, it's just not safe. And so yeah, I'm very, very passionate about it. And I will say it's scary, patients that we think we're treating well, how much hypoxia we see. So I feel like it's just the tip of the iceberg. But it allows us to make tweaks in their CPAP. It allows us to make tweaks in their oral appliance, to consider other newer technologies like Inspire therapy and various nasal procedures that I can do. The point is we're not just telling them you're good, we'll see you next year. We're actually more or less doing a sleep study every night to make sure that they are good and that we will see them next year and they're not dead.
That's amazing. Yeah. I mean, especially bringing that, like you said, essentially doing a sleep study on a regular basis, versus,
Yeah.
like so many of these other tests, whether it's, an EKG or a radiology image, it's one point in time. So I think that's
Right.
very powerful. I'm curious as we wrap up here, you've done all these different, you've run a private practice, you've, started a GPO, you've done digital health, you've done medical device. For physicians out there that want to develop their business acumen, and it sounds like a lot of yours came from definitely experience, but I'm curious if you have any other advice on, because like you mentioned, we don't, most physicians, unless they did an MBA or had a prior career or something, they don't learn any business, acumen or concepts really until they, like you said, are kind of forced to. I guess maybe what's kind of your kind of basic advice when it comes to physicians trying to broaden their knowledge in that realm?
Yeah, as it stands today, I think fight our tendency to, again, how we're trained to be at the end of the ER, taking care of that trauma patient by ourselves and not letting that patient die until help comes, right? That's not how to do the business side of medicine. To early and often find colleagues with competence in areas that you aren't as strong in. And then that dovetails into really my dream, as I now am really blessed and fortunate and these companies are maturing, and the way I want to give back. And I have my older daughter is pre-med. She'll be in medical school next year. So she's a senior in college right now. And one of the ways I want to give back to all those who have helped me is to set up part of the curriculum at my undergraduate institution, my medical institution, and at Vanderbilt, a course, if you will, on the business sides of medicine, and then how a physician brings an idea from the proverbial cocktail napkin to commercialization. So where we all can teach each other, a big dream of mine at USENT as that continues to grow and is to have our own incubator, a safe place where physicians can bring their ideas and other physicians can invest in it or whatever, but they're less likely to have those ideas stolen and exploited. And so I think as it stands today, since those things really don't exist very, very much, loading the boat early and getting, partnerships with people that can help you. But over time, I'm hopeful that there will be programs in our education that deal with these flaws in our current education, from my perspective, deficits that we don't get.
Yeah, definitely. I guess my last question to you is, I ask everybody this: when you're not doing ENT and running all these companies and developing new technology, how do you balance yourself? What are your passions outside that, if you can find that balance?
Yeah. it's so important to find balance. And of course, if you ask my loved ones, they probably would say I don't have that. But I love travel, I love exercise, I love cooking, especially on my green egg, but all kinds of cooking. My both of my daughters are in college. They're at the same college, and it's not very far away. So I love spending time with them and getting to know them. The older one is pre-med, as I mentioned. The younger one is entrepreneurship. So she's in business, and I'm jealous of her when I see the classes that she's taking. I think, I wish I would have taken that, because you end up having the same classes in medical school that I took in undergrad. But all of those things. Just seeing the world, it's just so mind opening to get out of your little bubble and your routine and just see how other people live and experience it. So that's how I like to spend my free time.
That's awesome. Well, Dr. Matheny, really appreciate you taking the time out of your very busy schedule to talk with us. I certainly learned a lot. I'm sure the listeners will as well. I guess the last thing is where can people, find you or connect with you if they want to reach out? What's the best platform
absolutely.
to do that on?
Well, thank you for this opportunity, Maxwell, and best of luck to you and your endeavors. So many people made themselves available to me all the time, and so I do the same. So probably the easiest way is to find me on LinkedIn. That's my primary social media platform, and then from there, I've met many wonderful people, learned a lot. Some of us now work together on various ventures, and hopefully I've helped a few people get further down the road. So that's probably the best way.
Awesome. Well, we'll definitely provide that link below. And again, thank you again. We really, really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DaVinci Hour podcast, presented by DaVinci Academy. Please be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow the podcast on your podcast platform of choice to catch the latest episodes. Please leave a comment or a review and share it with a friend. Lastly, you can find all of our podcasts, video courses, and books on our website, dviacademy.com. Thank you for listening.